We are 44 hours on from President Trump's Rose Garden moment where he unveiled worldwide tariffs, his self-proclaimed Liberation Day. And true to Newton's third law of motion, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And that applies to the response from the world's second most powerful economy, China, today. When Donald Trump unveiled his table of worst offenders, you can see it was topped by Beijing, following the EU in second. China slapped with a 34% import tax, on top of 20% for products the president had already applied. So tonight, 6 p.m. Beijing time, the Chinese government struck back, saying it would retaliate with 34% tax on all US goods arriving in China and blocking the sale of rare earth minerals as well. We're going to look more detail at that in a moment, but I want to head first to Brussels, where as Western countries are scrambling to respond to the tariffs, NATO foreign ministers have been speaking with their US counterpart Marco Rubio, who's in town for the first time since taking the job, in Europe for the first time as well. Now, the Ukraine war is at the forefront of those talks and how Europe steps up the status of peace talks with Putin right now. This is what Mr. Rubio had to say on that.
What we're not interested in, and I'm not accusing them of this, I'm just telling you what we're not interested in is negotiations about negotiations. That we're not going to continue this forever. So none of it was threatening. I think it was more an explanation of this is our timeline. And at some point, it'll be clear whether you want peace or you don't want peace. And that time is coming. It's pretty short. At the same time, as you now have seen, members of Congress have begun to file bills to increase sanctions.
Well, that was Marco Rubio. The stock markets, as I say, have been a sea of red today. Hundreds of billions wiped off the value of companies. President Trump has said this was to be expected, likening the US economy to a patient that he said is very sick, needs urgent operation. And after the difficulties, he repeated the narrative that it will make Americans wealthy again. Meanwhile, he claims China's response today is total panic. They're playing it wrong, he said. Now, Marco Rubio was also speaking about tariffs, and he said he didn't think it fair to say economies are crashing, markets crashing, because he said the markets are based on the stock value of companies who today are embodied and embedded in the modes of production that he said were bad for the US. Well, let's cross to Washington, D.C. Let's bring in Mignon Houston, Deputy Spokesperson at the US Department of State. Great to have you on the programme this evening, Mignon. Let's begin. There's a lot going on. Let's begin with the message to Moscow. The US patience on peace and Russia is not infinite. And Finland's leader, let me mention this to you, President Stubb, who's been playing golf with President Trump this week, he has said the deadline for President Putin should be for Easter, April the 20th. Is that what you're looking at?
Thank you for having me on the show. Let me start by saying that this administration has been very clear that a negotiated end to this war is a priority for us. We understand that will require compromise, that will require decisions on the behalf of Russia and Ukraine, and this is something we are focused on in advancing this negotiated end to this war. The administration has been very clear, as I mentioned before, that the suffering has gone on for far too long. And I don't have any dates in terms of the date that you mentioned, any dates to preview, but what I can say is we will continue to advance an end to this war as long as it takes.
The Secretary of State has spoken, Mignon, about wanting NATO members this week to step up to 5% of GDP, essentially fix up, look sharp when it comes to defence. But what if nations don't or can't? Is this an advice from a friend, or is this, there are consequences to face if they don't?
Look, let's take it back. The administration has said as it relates to reciprocal tariffs, and that is this is an action to ensure that we are freeing the American people, the American economy from being so heavily dependent on foreign countries for the supplies that we critically need in the United States. This is an important step. It is a step that is quite fitting to speak about today, as today, 76 years ago on April 4th, is when we talked about our NATO alliance. And this is working with our partners to support the policies that really bring us to the next level. When it comes to tariffs, the United States has been disadvantaged in a lot of ways as it relates to trade policies. We've been disadvantaged. Our American manufacturers, American workers have been disadvantaged. We're looking at increasing opportunities for trade that will really support the American people.
Well, I think given the scale of developments this week. We're probably at cross purposes slightly, but I want to look at both things. What I mentioned to you about NATO, the idea that other countries should have 5% of their GDP for NATO spending, and that message from Marco Rubio, is that an advice from a friend, or does that come with consequences for NATO members? So what's your thought on that?
Sure. I mean, the Secretary Rubio being present for the NATO ministerial was really just a symbolic action to show that our commitment to the NATO alliance is strong, that our commitment to Article 5 is strong, that we will continue to work closely with our NATO allies, but at the same time, as you suggested, that we are really looking for an increase in investment, in defense investment from our NATO allies, that it is time for us to really answer that question that the President is calling on our NATO allies to answer, which is, are NATO allies in a position to really support, to really be capable of defending NATO territories? And in order to answer that question, we can look at the example of what has happened right on the homeland in Europe, as Secretary Rubio has pointed to in his remarks with the Secretary General Root, that we saw that this devastating war between Ukraine and Russia really sort of created mass consequences, destabilizing effects across the region. And it is important for NATO allies to come together to think about how they can best increase defense spending and invest more in defense policies that will benefit NATO allies writ large. We know that these decisions are not going to be easy. The Secretary has made very clear that when making these decisions, we have to be cognizant of the fact that that will mean we have to prioritize certain policies over other policies. These are what the Secretary mentioned, very hard decisions, very tough decisions that need to be made. But it is a strategic imperative to ensure that we are making decisions that keep the NATO alliance strong, capable, and viable to defend its territories. And so I don't have any actions to preview as far as consequences. I can't speak to anything that could be hypothetical or that's not happened yet. But what I can say is our commitment to the NATO alliance is strong. It is a commitment that continues to be our priority, but we need to see stronger support as it relates to investment in the defense systems.
Your Secretary of State is seen as a traditional transatlanticist, big supporter of Europe in the past. Do you worry that he risks losing friends of a number of triage of issues? You've got, clearly concerns in the room at NATO from ministers saying, what about our tariffs? What can we do? And at the same time, we're not far from Signalgate and the questions of Europe being, quote, pathetic, being mentioned in the group. President Trump's talked about the EU being pathetic, what it's doing on tariffs. Is Marco Rubio fully signed up to that? Or, do those things kind of contradict each other?
Well, look, I can only speak to what we've heard from this administration, and that is a commitment to our partners, a commitment to our allies. The reciprocal trade is really to level the playing field, right? To level the playing field so that we are seeing trade relationships that are fair, that are reciprocal, so that we are not creating disadvantages for the American economy. This does not constitute a change in our political relationships with these countries. It does not constitute a lessening of our commitment with these countries. By the contrary, it really states that we are looking at this administration to carry out the mandate that the American people voted for when they elected President Trump. And that is a president that would focus on keeping America safe, secure, and prosperous. This is an important step towards doing so. This is an important step to ensuring that the American economy is strong and viable. If we are going to continue to be a leader and a player, we have to look out for our economy as well. And that's exactly what we're doing here.
Just one other thought, Mignon. We had the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, a few weeks ago, said he put out a plan, sent it to Washington, sent it with an idea to say they want to know, Europeans want to know to what extent the US is pulling away from Europe, manoeuvring towards the Far East and manoeuvring away from NATO in the Central Command so that they could fill in the void, fill in the blanks. He says he still hasn't heard. Is he likely to?
Look, we have a strong commitment to the Indo-Pacific, but we also equally have a strong commitment to our NATO allies. Those two are not mutually exclusive. We are working together on all fronts diplomatically, led by Secretary Rubio, to ensure our relationships are viable, continue to be long-standing. And so I would say there is nothing to preview regarding that question. It's actually sort of not entirely accurate as it relates to how we view our relationships globally, that we will maintain our presence in the Indo-Pacific, we will maintain our our security policies and engagements in the Indo-Pacific, and we will ensure that there is no, we will deter any sort of attacks to our allies in that area, but we also will be very clear that we are going to continue to support our NATO alliance, and that this is a step to move towards furthering that support and ensuring the NATO alliance is capable, strong, and viable.
So your point briefly is that Boris Pistorius, the German defence minister, he's got it wrong when he thinks that the US are looking to weaken their influence over NATO and start to lessen their impact. There's fake news. There's nothing happening there. US commitment will stay the same.
Well, I can just repeat Secretary Rubio, which is that our commitment to the NATO alliance remains, our commitment to Article 5 remains, and that is where we are today.
Really good to talk to you, Mignon. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Mignon Houston, Deputy Spokesperson for the Department of State. Thank you again. Have a good evening. Let's go from Washington, D.C. Let's go to Oxford. Let's try to understand on the issue of tariffs the Chinese position a little more deeply and the effects of the clash of the titans economically. George Magnus is an economist, author of Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy, an associate at the China Centre at Oxford University. Great to have you on the programme this evening. George, let's first start off with the timing of this, because let's face it, it was, gone 4 o'clock, Beijing leaving it very late today, close of play, to announce these measures. There are some suggestions that the Chinese leadership were looking for some negotiation, some opt-outs, and when nothing came, they pressed the reciprocal tariff button. What's your take?
Yes, this is quite a full-throated and quite escalatory announcement from Beijing. I think that a lot of people thought that just as the previous Chinese responses to Trump's 10% tariffs that were announced twice earlier this year were kind of calibrated to keep what looked like a kind of possible dialogue open and, even a possible deal, actually, under which they might resurrect some of the trade negotiating that they were doing in 2018. This comes as a bit of a bombshell, really, and I'm sure it hasn't gone down very well in the White House at all. And it shows, one, that the Chinese government is really suffering a bit of pique as a consequence of Trump's 34% increase in tariffs that were announced this week, on top of the other ones, but also, I think, a call to arms to other countries, including in Europe, to join with Beijing in standing up to Washington.
Which I think you touch upon what many analysts would say is a fear of Donald Trump in saying there shouldn't be retaliation. That is the coordination with Canada, Europe, Mexico, China at the same time. There would be big implications on the US economy. Tell me what your thoughts are on the immediate implications now for the Chinese economy, for business, for the public in general, if these tariffs stay in place and stay the same.
Well, I mean, because the imports going into China from the United States are so much smaller than the other way around. In other words, the Americans ship about $140 to $150 billion worth of product into China, but the flows going the other way are about 3 times as big. So the small volume of goods going into China from the United States actually means that the scope of these tariffs to harm the Chinese economy in and of themselves that scope is probably quite limited. And there are ways in which the Chinese government can mitigate the consequences of that hit. So without going into a lot of boring detail, my estimate really is that the range of damage, let's say, to the Chinese economic growth this year might be in the band of about 0.5% to 1%. But if they let the renminbi depreciate, in other words, that lowers the price of Chinese goods to Americans and others, and if they also take other kind of mitigating measures, they could limit that damage. That's not the most important thing for them, but obviously the optics of being in a trade war with the United States and coming on top of lots of other areas of contention, for example, the sale of ports by C.K. Hutchison to the American asset manager BlackRock, and lots of other areas of friction mean that the Chinese don't want to be seen, I think, to be knuckling under or to be weak in response to the Trump administration.
Well, you mentioned the renminbi trap. This is their efforts to try to internationalize the Chinese currency. And within your book as well, Red Flags, you talk about 4 traps. You talk about the debt trap that China faces, the economic expansion fueled by massive borrowing. You talk about a middle income trap, that China risks stalling before transitioning to a high income economy, the renminbi trap you talk about, and also aging population, which is affecting a number of countries. Where would you frame the Trump trap right now? Does that go right to the top, the immediate challenge for Xi?
It's definitely a kind of a front and center problem, because the basic condition of the Chinese economy isn't that great. I mean, obviously they have a very dynamic and almost envied modern sector, which includes climate change mitigation, solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, batteries, and so on. But this is really only a relatively small part of China's economy. Most of it is really in the doldrums. They have, employment problems, they have productivity problems, they have, governance issues with the private sector. So coming on top of all of that, this externally imposed problem, which is about, the constraints on exports potentially, is just bad timing. And so it might also be quite kind of localized for China. So obviously the dynamic provinces in China are all on the eastern seaboard coastal side, and that's where kind of the bulk of China's exports come from. So we would need to look, I think, during the next several months as to how economic conditions are in the usually better off regions, and what is happening to employment in those areas too.
Let's remind ourselves, George, let's go back to the Rose Garden, Wednesday, 4 o'clock. Let's have a listen to what specifically Donald Trump had to say about China.
So we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset? They will be, because we never charge anybody anything, but now we're going to charge.
So on this table of worst offenders, George, each territory has this written list of issues and obstacles to the US. For example, if you look at the data set, I think one of the issues attributed to the UK was as specific as this. It was unfairness to US chartered accountants working in Britain, because to qualify as a chartered accountant in the UK, you have to work and have worked in the UK. Have you managed to look at some of the key negative points for China? Obviously we heard about the allegations of currency manipulation, but what other things have you picked up?
Well, I mean, I think that I don't personally pay much attention to the excuses which are kind of trotted out by the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Trade Representative's office in the United States, because I think we all found out pretty quickly after the Rose Garden announcement that the formula that they used to calculate these reciprocal tariffs was, it's not funny, but I mean, they're quite comical, and they don't really speak to the kinds of things which the Treasury actually had spoken about, which was about, taxes and, currency situation and lots of other things that could be measured, but which are very, very complicated in international trade. So, I think that basically, the United States, or this government in the United States, actually starts off from a proposition, which is that balanced trade is a good thing, and therefore tariffs can be and should be used in order to rebalance trade. I mean, most economists would think that that is complete nonsense, and that, that no sensible country or government would actually organize and manage its trade in that way. Now, that's not to excuse the abuses of the international trading system, which China has been guilty of, really, for many, many years. But the Americans have found a particularly obtuse way of trying to go about correcting it. So I just think, we are obviously in a very kind of difficult and potentially quite dangerous situation. I'm not saying, for example, by the way, that there can't yet be a trade arrangement between the United States and China. I just think the optics now look pretty grim about it happening anytime soon.
Yes, well, George, great to hear you this evening. Economist, author of Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy, associate at the China Centre 2 at Oxford University. Thank you, George, for your time.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, according to the chair of the Fed Reserve, Jerome Powell, today, in the last few hours, saying this: the Trump administration's expansive new tariffs, he believes, will likely head to higher inflation, slower growth, higher unemployment as well. These were written remarks in the past few hours. Let's bring in Fraser. Fraser Jackson, our correspondent in Washington. Fraser, President Trump is up and about. Updating his social media, it seems. What's your view on how the White House is seeing this play out? And also, TikTok comes into it, doesn't it, when it comes to relations with China? There seems to be some kind of a negotiating tool offered to Beijing.
Yeah, and Donald Trump sees TikTok especially as a kind of key tool in this relationship as well, because he believes in part it was because of TikTok and the youth vote that he was handed the keys to the White House once again. So TikTok, he has kind of been seen as the savior of, as he kicked that can down the road, as if you cast your minds back, the divestiture that was going to have to happen so that TikTok would be bought by an American company. Well, Trump kicked that can down the road and then is now coming up with this plan to try to get TikTok sold off to an American company. There was a report just about 2 days ago that Amazon was interested in purchasing TikTok as well. So it is a key part of Donald Trump's relationship and the way that he deals with China as well. But more widely, these tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed on China and other countries really are Donald Trump's way of trying to undo some of the unfairness that he says the world has wrought upon America. He said that they've taken advantage of the United States for too long, and he sees these tariffs as a way of being able to get foreign investment back into America as well, to try to rejuvenate the manufacturing industry in this country. Now, it should be noted, of course, now this is not something which is going to happen overnight. These kind of multi-billion-dollar deals that Donald Trump likes to traipse out and talk about, I'm thinking of the things by Apple and Eli Lilly and other giant multinationals as well. They are not going to be something that takes place in the short term. It's going to be a long-term investment. And there's also, unless we get a more concrete timeline of the funding that these companies are going to provide to the United States, there's nothing to stop these companies walking that funding back once the office holder of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue changes as well. So at the moment, Donald Trump is touting these as a win. But I think the fact that he made this announcement at 4 p.m. once the markets closed is a very good indicator that he knew that this was going to have a negative impact on the markets. And of course, we've been seeing that over the course of the last 2 days. Very
interesting, and how Beijing waited till 4 o'clock on a Friday to do the same thing in China. Now, just your take, we were listening just where you were standing a short while ago to Mignon Houston, Deputy Spokesperson for the Department of State. You're used to listening to the minutiae of detail to spokespeople. There were kind of emollient words, I think, on the sense of the relationship with NATO, with Europe, with tariffs as well. Did you pick anything out there that as a takeaway from perhaps state of relations on both sides of the pond?
I think it's interesting because when you talk to people from the State Department, these are obviously they're a real kind of subset of the federal worker, because they are used to dealing with foreign nations on a daily basis. They're normally more outward-looking people. So the kind of clash of the America First ideology with the State Department in particular is something that I found quite fascinating to watch. And I think when I talk to sources and people that I know who work inside State Departments, a lot of them are kind of in peril and really worried about what's happening at State Department and being fed from the top down. I also say when I talk to sources who have to deal with the State Department, they often say that there is a real middle of this department which is being absolutely gutted, and they don't have anybody really to work with. They have senior officials on the top who are handing down policy, but there's nobody to really enforce that policy. And then you have on the bottom a lot of interim and beginner people who also are pushing those details through. But it's an interesting transitional phase for state.
Fraser, great to talk to you as always. Our correspondent in Washington.